Okay, well, welcome everybody. Good night, good morning, good afternoon, regardless on what part of the world you are in. Bree, I'm sure it's good morning Friday for you. You're connecting from Australia. Anyways, thank you for connecting to this session, the third and last one of our co-host session with Diego Rodriguez here present, where we're exploring ways of mainstreaming tools, approaches, and in general DMDU science to the water resources and in general the decision-making sector. So for this last session, we have 4 presentations. The first one is from Bree Bennett. She's a lecturer at the University of Adelaide in Australia, and she works on applying modeling and simulations to assess the impact of climate variability on natural and engineered systems. She will present us a very interesting R package for scenario neutral climate impact. Then we will have Sarah Freeman, who is a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst at the Hydro Systems Group. She's also leading at this institution. She's leading the group that studies is in charge of studying the Resilience by Design project in the Valley of Mexico. So she will tell us more about this project and how her work engages with multiple actors and institutions. Then we will have Nadia Sitaram. She's a doctoral researcher in the Earth and Environmental Department at the Florida International University. So she looks at how sea level rise might disproportionately affect socially and economically vulnerable communities in Miami. So she will tell us more about this exciting topic. And last but not least, we will have Shinedum Elua, who is also a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, at the same Hydro Systems Group. And he mainly works on helping governments deciding which water resources infrastructure investments can be chosen given a wide range of uncertain futures. And well, he will tell us more about his work in Tanzania. So I think that's all from me. I will leave the floor to our first expositor. Bree, please, whenever you're ready, just feel free to start and share your presentation.
Thank you very much, Diego. I'm sorry, Homero. Thank you to both of you, Homero and Diego, for having us in this session. All right, well, as Homero has already said, I'm presenting to you bright and early on the 13th of November from the future in Australia. So I'm more leveraging the tools angle of this session, and I'm very excited to have a chat to you today about Foresight, which is an R package to evaluate system performance under hydroclimate variability and change. This package has been developed over a number of years through a number of PhD and postdoc projects at the University of Adelaide, all the way back starting with Dan-Lu Guo, who's now at the University of Melbourne, and most recently Anjana Devanand, who's a postdoc with our group, who's been working on enhancing the package and bringing it along as we develop more in the space. All right, well, I'm sure most of you are familiar with scenario neutral bottom-up approaches, but I'll just backtrack for a second. So scenario neutral or bottom-up approaches, that term's often used very interchangeably, are a rapidly emerging approach for climate impact assessment of both natural and engineered systems. Now, the principles on which these approaches are based are that it's focused on a stress test of a system, but to a very wide range of plausible hydroclimate scenarios. So taking that system and really shaking it about to understand how it behaves and if the wheels fall off in any particular situation. So these particular approaches largely seek to overcome limitations of the more traditional and longer standing top-down approaches by, as I said, focusing on the system and making sure you enhance your system understanding by doing the work and inherently recognizing that systems are complex and the links with climate and other factors are often very non-trivial in the systems we're looking at, whether they be natural or engineered sort of infrastructure systems, for example. By doing this approach, we find it generally better articulates the uncertainty around how the system is behaving in response to all these factors. All right, so that all sounds well and good, but I think we'd largely say that top-down approaches still remain sort of a preferred and trusted method in practice. Why might this be? Well, the top-down approach is based on a very clear modelling train coming down from our sort of climate and socioeconomic projections through our global circulation model outputs, for example, through our downscaling approaches, the application to our system model, for example, and then determining how that system is performing for each prediction. You might find that for some it's performing well, for others not so well, and then using expert knowledge to determine, you know, how those different projections are relating to your system, and interpreting it that way. In contrast, our sort of general scenario neutral approach, where we're looking at stress testing it to a wide range of different plausible climates, we might change and perturb the climate in a number of ways. So let's say we increase average annual temperature and annual total rainfall. Whoops. We then need to generate a climate time series so that we can subject our system to this. We can then apply this to our system model, determine how that performs, and then we sort of cycle around and enumerate throughout all the plausible and combinations we want to test based on how we think our system is performing and what it's sensitive to, and a bit beyond that, to really understand sort of how the system performs as a whole throughout the spectrum of potential plausible climate futures. And then we can always bring in and have a look at our traditional sort of climate projection approach in context of the system and how we're seeing it behave in the wider range of scenarios that we wanted to explore. All right, so as you see from that little run through of the general approach, there's a number of challenges that do remain for the practical implementation of this in a mainstream approach. So there is logistical as well as technical challenges. So the logistical challenge is the sort of just the overhead in managing the stress test itself, and that's where a package can really lend a hand in terms of just streamlining processes for those who want to take this sort of approach on board. And then there's the technical challenge, which is the need to strategically stress test, because you don't want to be choosing a range of plausible scenarios that actually aren't properly investigating what the system will respond to and enhancing your system understanding. All right, so on the first one, the logistics in terms of managing a stress test, well, you've got multiple models and data sources to wrangle. You might have at the system end a number of system models. You'll probably have a number of models in terms of generating your climate inputs. And often due to this and the wide net we want to cast in terms of stress testing the system, you end up with a higher dimensional range of outputs, which does present a visualization and interpretation challenge if you just chuck the phone book at the system. And then on the other hand, in terms of strategically stress testing the system, you do need to identify the key system stresses. And this is across the multiple climate variables that your system responds to, as well as multiple properties of these climate variables. So for example, in the case of precipitation, it's not just the amounts, or say the annual amounts that you want to deal with. You're looking at intermittency, you're looking at extremes, you're looking at seasonality. It might be multi-year type trends, and you want to make sure that if your system's sensitive to these things, you are exploring variations in these. And all of these stresses, of course, are changing system to system, bearing in mind that this approach is very focused on looking at the system and enhancing that system understanding. So it's a very system focused, and it's going to be a very customized analysis for every system that you want to evaluate. So In terms of strategically stress testing, you do need to create these scenarios with the required properties. So we're looking at taking those key system stresses and actually perturbing these so we can see how it plays out as these are perturbed over our plausible range. So one thing that we'll all be familiar with and is quite easy to do is to take a time series and simply scale it. So multiply it by a certain factor, and that's good, but there are certain limitations in terms of it won't be able to mix up intermittency, for example, in rainfall. So we can get a little bit more fancy, but this gets a bit more involved again. We need more models where you can examine a variety of climate properties. So one way of doing this to look at these changes in combination is to use an inverse approach where you might look at changing, say, for example, the extreme rainfall, the wet spell length, but not the total rainfall, but also the winter rainfall and the average summer rainfall. And you're going to need something a bit more sophisticated, like an inverse approach, for example, that Dan-Luc Gour pioneered back in 2018, where you look at generating using a stochastic weather generator and using a search algorithm to find parameters that give you that particular characteristics that you want. So in terms of this, we know we have logistical overheads. We know we have a risk of ineffective stress testing if we use inappropriate stresses, or we have challenges in producing our time series. The problem with this is if we miss key stresses, we end up missing our system failure and behavior. So this is what brings us to the R tool for scenario neutral climate impact assessments. So the tool Foresight, so it's a backronym of Systems Insights from the Generation of Hydroclimate Time Series. It is available on CRAN, and really it enables complete analysis and takes you through that nice modelling cycle to investigate your system. So from taking the simple scaling and the stochastic generation of scenarios, having a look at how those scenarios are performing to making sure that you're producing good time series suitable for your system via some automatic diagnostics generation. And you can tweak a number of things in terms of what kind of models you want to use for that time series. You can play with the optimization, search algorithm settings. If it's stochastic generation, you can vary the simulation length and so forth. So just doing a quick run through the various Foresight elements. Yes, you can generate the time series, but also you can integrate the analysis of your system within there via the package. You just insert an R wrapper to control it, but you can still plug it back in. For example, if your external system model is a bit more cumbersome and using a GUI, for example. We have a number of visualization tools where you can have a look at, how the system performance is changing with your perturbed variables. I've just taken a simple two-dimensional example, but you may have a certain threshold point which you want to observe, and you can also add that on there. And again, you can have a look at your different system models and how they're performing when subjected to climate projections as well, and see how their performance actually overlays on your system and whether there's something else going on within those projections as well. You can also have a look at it more in terms of how the system behaves in terms of, violation of a number of thresholds on different performance metrics as well. All right, in terms of support, there are tutorials and demonstration system model. For example, this basic domestic tank model within the package, as well as obviously all the help and documentation and a vignette. So in terms of future development, we are looking to be a community-driven approach to accelerate technical developments and development of additional software features. And as we move forward, we will build on the diagnostic tools, visualizations, and efficiency of the modeling approaches. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of Foresight. You can download it now at CRAN, but there is a new version coming very soon. In terms of contact points for the package, it's either myself or Anjana, and we do hope to hear from you.
Great, really, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I really like the package. I guess, if someone has questions, please feel free to drop those questions here in the chat, and then we can have a discussion at the end of all the presentations. I think that would be probably the best way. So thanks again for this. Anyways, now let's go to our next presentation. Let's go now to Sarah Freeman. If you're ready, just pop in your presentation whenever you want.
It's great to be here. I'm just turning on my timer. And great to be able to share some of our work that we've been doing in Mexico City and the surrounding area. In honor of that, my background today is actually a photo that I took once from one of the skyscrapers in Mexico City, actually where the World Bank offices are, overlooking the city, so that I can at least somehow feel like I'm there, even though I haven't been able to go down there in quite some while. So when thinking about global water management, and specifically cities, I think, granted, things right now are quite uncertain in terms of directions that they're going, but a couple of interesting facts to remember is that if we look at the world's surface area, under 3% is occupied by cities. And yet some estimates say that up to around 90% of the world's GDP is actually produced in cities. So cities are very important to our economies. They're important to the way that we manage resources, including water, right? So why is urban water management important? Right now, global population, about 1 in 8 people live in megacities. By 2030, the number of megacities is estimated to increase from 33, which it is currently, to 43. By 2050, 68% of the global population will be living in these cities, and by 2050, the increase in urban water demand will be anywhere around 50 to 80%. And of course, that a large part of that growth, actually, the vast majority of it is happening in the developing world, where there's already a lack of access to, potable water supply and sanitation services. And so we get into this question of how are we going to better manage our water resources in these urban settings. And two things that are important to highlight about these systems is that they are complicated. And when I say that, I mean that physically where they're taking water from is usually diverse. It's piped, sometimes over large tracts of land, in order to get to the cities. The way it's distributed is sometimes even hard for the operators to completely understand what happens, what happens within the system. But then on top of that, you overlay this issue of how the water is actually managed in terms of the institutions and the regulatory policies. And so you get this sort of other layer of complexity that makes decisions hard to make. And something that has always sort of underpinned the way that we've always talked about best practices in water management is integration, right? Integrated water resources management, integrated urban water resources management. And yet the sort of goal of how to do this is still, it's still sort of elusive, right? And so one question that I have been thinking about a lot in the context of our work there is, why isn't that being implemented? And what we see a lot of times in terms of what people point to are a few factors. One being these mismatches in terms of your spatial extents, both for your urban water supply versus the basins that it's coming from, also the hydrology versus the political. And then on top of that, you have this institutional fragmentation, multiple institutions operating at different scales across different sectors who aren't necessarily communicating with one another. And then if that wasn't enough, you have this growing sort of demand and competition for the resource. And so a lot of times what a lot of these factors sort of boil down to are these institutional and regulatory frameworks. And so I'm an engineer, I model things, you know, how do I deal with this? And so in the context of what we're doing, I kind of circled around this question for our work in the piece that I'm going to share with you today, which is what is the importance of the institutional and regulatory setting in driving or mitigating vulnerability? And this work is not complete yet, so this is sort of a preview. Would love for discussion and ideas, always welcome. So we're working in Mexico City, which there's a population of around 22 million in the metropolitan area. The city itself is, the latest estimate I saw is that it's responsible for around 20% of the national GDP. And this piece of work is part of a much larger piece of work with the World Bank and a lot of other partners on the ground to look at sort of what are the investments and options and policies that can be implemented to improve the resiliency of the water supply for not just Mexico City, but the surrounding areas that it's drawing water from. So going back to this question, so how are our management objectives for the system affected by these, what I'm calling policy factors, which includes the regulatory frameworks and institutions, and how might those effects be modulated by climate change? In order to answer that question, you first have to understand how Mexico City's water is managed. And so I'm going to try to run you through that as quickly as possible. So if we start with the system, this is sort of a mapping of Mexico City on the right. They draw a large portion of their water from the aquifer. It's around, depending on the year, it ranges around 38 to 50% of their water comes from the aquifer. There's a few additional external systems that you'll see to the north and to the east, which are also groundwater supply systems coming from the state of Mexico. To the west, you have the Alto Lerma system, which is predominantly groundwater at this point, which also has been piped over to Mexico City. And then further west from that, you have the Cutzamala system, which is a very important water system to the city. It provides anywhere between 20 to 35% of the water supply for the city, and pumps the water up over a kilometer in elevation. So it's at an extreme cost in terms of the electricity consumed to do it. And so we consider all that water supply, and we've engaged stakeholders also in each of these three individual systems, those three being Cutzamala, Lerma, and Mexico City itself, to ask them what their sort of objectives are for management. And so we have a collection of these objectives about, how much water they want, when, et cetera. And sort of mapping this out on more of a schematic, this is what you get. So you have your demand nodes, which are these gray portions. You have the supply nodes, which are the little teal boxes. Now, if we start to add in the institutional component, I'm going to start with your operation and regulatory actors, and specifically the municipal water actors. So you have your municipal water utilities, and you have your municipalities. So you're starting to sort of starting to fill in a picture of what's going on. Then you get on top of that state water agencies, so the water commissions. In particular, I've pulled out the state of Mexico because that plays a very important role, but there's also the state water commissions for their states that play a role also, in particular in the part of the Lerma basin. Then you overlay CONAGUA, which is the National Water Authority, which has 3 different levels that are mostly coordinated, but sometimes, you know, it can be difficult. So we start at the local level, which is in charge of sort of operating different infrastructure in different parts of the supply system. And then on top of that, you add their river basin offices. So in particular, we're looking at Ocovam, which operates the Cutzamala system. And then on top of that, you have the federal level of CONAGUA, which is in charge of a lot of the regulatory components. And so, oh, sorry, and that's not it. And then on top of that, you also get a lot of unregulated use. And so you have, you know, unregulated use in the Cutzamala system, as well as in Mexico City and other areas of the basin, private water suppliers and basin councils. And so the challenge here was to try to figure out a way to translate all of this into a problem that could be solved, right? And so the way that I've gone about it is trying to define within the system where are the sort of touch points for either negotiations to occur between different institutions and who has to be involved, and then points where regulatory action is actually very important in the system. And so that's what you'll see here. You have the little squares are your negotiation points, and your the little D's over here are for your regulatory points. So back to the main question, how are management objectives affected by these policy factors, and how is that modulated by climate change? So I'm going to show sort of a glimpse into what I'm starting to do now. I pulled out a small portion of the analysis to just sort of start to test it all, and that portion of the analysis is looking at Mexico City and the Cutzamala water system, so specifically looking at their management objectives in terms of deliveries. In terms of the salient policy components, we're looking at about 4 different institutional actors, 3 different intervention points in terms of where things either could be negotiated or regulated. And again, this portion of the system is around 1/3 of the water supply. So the question is, what is the current status quo? So I applied sensitivity analysis methods, specifically looking at Sobol sensitivity analysis, to look at how, in the first part, how currently the system and both Cutzamala and Mexico City's management objectives are being affected by the other one. And so under current climate, what we see is here on the left, we're looking at the influence of regulation in the Cutzamala system on management objectives in blue for Mexico City and in red for Cutzamala. So what we see is that they're mainly influenced by themselves, although, you know, to a certain extent also by Mexico City. And then for the other side, we're looking at the influence of regulating use in Mexico City on the management objectives of, again, both Cutzamala and Mexico City. And so the interesting thing here is that we see that under current conditions, the system, for the most part, is relatively self-contained. So, you know, what happens in Mexico City mostly affects them. What happens in Cutzamala mostly affects them, with a slight caveat that for Mexico City, the Cutzamala system actually has a little bit more of an influence. Now, and I promise to wrap this up quickly. So looking at now how that changes with climate change, this is in the case of Mexico City. So basically the redder the color, the more influence there is. And so what we see for Mexico City really is that the level of interdependence, or its dependence on what's happening in Cutzamala, only really sort of like decreases under wetter conditions. So they're already slightly reliant on them. For Cutzamala, the interesting thing is that you know, under status quo, they're not super reliant on Mexico City, but under drier conditions, that is going to start to change. And so the sort of takeaways from this sort of initial look into how to start to go about answering these questions is that, you know, interdependence really is something to look at, is important to look at, especially as we start to change the climate and it gets drier. Flexibility in institutional arrangements may be important, and something that I plan to do is dive in a little bit deeper into which institutions that entails and if there are any bilateral relationships that are more important than others. With that, I will just say, yeah, thank you. And to be continued.
And indeed, to be continued. Again, to the audience, if you have any questions, just feel free to drop in here and then we can have our discussion afterwards. Our next presentation is Nadia Sitterman. So please, Nadia, whenever you are free, whenever you want, just feel free to pop in your presentation here.
Great, thank you. Here we go. I hope that is all good. Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. My name is Nadia Sitterman, and I'm a PhD candidate at Florida International University. Really excited to be here with you all to present some of the work that I'm doing for my dissertation called Resilience for Whom? A Climate Mobility Framework for Assessing Equity Outcomes in Sea Level Rise Adaptation. So I'm going to be focusing most of my talk on sea level rise and the effects in South Florida. It is a huge current problem. It will be an even larger problem in the future. Currently, you know, just from looking at pictures earlier this week from Tropical Storm Eta, which was still a tropical storm, it flooded most of the county, and so this is just an ongoing challenge as well as a future one. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the current projections that have been put out by the Southeast Florida Regional Compact for Climate Change. They produce these unified sea level projections every 4 years, or at least they seem to be on track for that. They're updating it constantly, which is really great, because we can see that even, you know, in the span of 4 years, just the 2030 scenario across the board shows a projected 2 inches increase across. And so sea level rise is here, it is happening, it is accelerating. And these events we know will contribute to migration and displacement of coastal communities over time if it's not already occurring. And so we have to adapt. But that's just a lot easier than saying we have to adapt. There are these huge constraints to adaptation that span governance. We're going to be, most of my talk is focused within this challenge of time horizon and uncertainty, and also these issues of equity. One of the things that we've been really thinking about is how do we fold in these layers of, differing socio-demographic conditions, different cultural conditions, historic inequity, and financial constraints that all should be considered in this large question of how do we adapt. With that being said, the question that we've been really thinking through is, how do we think about sea level rise induced migration given all those constraints? How do we make sense of all of that? And the one thing that I think I'd like to impress upon you all is that we need to sort of shift away from thinking that migration is just going to be this uniform, outward migration of whole regions, especially high-risk coastal areas, but that migration is actually ongoing now, that it is happening at smaller scales, and we need to start thinking about this, the multiplicities of climate migration, or what we're calling climate mobilities here. That migration, people are responding to sea level rise and adapting through migration, which is which is in itself an impact and then a consequence. of sea level rise. So what do I mean by all of that? So this schematic here was really developed for what we're seeing emerging in Miami, that, at some levels we are trying to understand, are we seeing this, when are we going to see this at scale? To what extent is it occurring right now? But it is something that our communities are voicing that, there is anecdotal evidence for, and it's, a very, an emerging topic. So we begin over here, where there are people living in these sort of low-lying areas that's denoted by this purplish region, where people are, just sort of seeing the impact of sea level rise. They are seeing flooding in their communities, tidal flooding, storm surge, realizing the impact, and either making a personal decision to move to an area of higher elevation, or even we're seeing the state respond in this way as well, realizing that investments on this side, these lower lying areas, are just not so good in the long term anymore, and the money and market forces are flowing to investments on the higher elevated areas. But people are already living there, and so what's happening on those higher elevated low risk areas is that property values are rising, rents are rising, buildings are being demolished, and generally causing displacement of the people that are already living here. And then we see another occurrence where those people then have to move as well, because they can no longer they can no longer afford these areas, and they might be migrating to areas of higher risk, where they might be trapped in place. And so we took a look at, the literature, and we took a look at figuring out, okay, we have, different experiences along the spectrum of exposure risk, and different experiences along the spectrum of socioeconomic vulnerability. And when we intersect them, what we can actually produce are 4 very distinct experiences along the intersection of those two spectrums. And that is, where we built this climate mobility framework. And so just sort of walking through that now, on the, in this quadrant over here, if you are, generally not experiencing risks posed by sea level rise, and you are of a low socioeconomic vulnerability, meaning fairly financially stable, but you don't really need to go anywhere in the long run. On the opposite side of that, exposure risk spectrum, you may have a very high risk to sea level rise. You're the one sort of seeing the flooding impacts occurring right now. And you also have, a high financial capacity to mitigate your own risk. Well, you might be thinking now's a good time to actually move. You just have the ability to do that at an individual level. But also, we've seen through, it's documented in literature that these are the groups of people that are most likely to receive intervention from the government, sort of financial help through either buyouts, relocations, disaster relief. And so, that's sort of built into this typology, the migrating typology. On this, moving towards the spectrum of socioeconomic vulnerability, if you are, considered of a highly socioeconomically vulnerable, but not experiencing too much sea level rise risk, well, you're not potentially that safe either, because this is where investments might actually flow. This is where people might flow to feel more safe. And so you could be potentially displaced, and that really categorizes that climate gentrification phenomena that we see emerging. And finally, the trap typology classifies people who are, experiencing a high level of sea level rise exposure risk and high socioeconomic vulnerability. They don't have the liquid assets, the financial ability to sort of move or mitigate their own risk in the short term or in the long term. And so we sort of classify them as trapped in that high risk geography. So in trying to figure out how do we apply this, how can we make this, how do we operationalize this? There have been 2 big questions that we've been really thinking through. Well, one, how should we assess social and economic vulnerability? What indicators matter the most? And also, what measures of exposure risk are available? Luckily for us, there are a lot of things that are already available in this space. And so we evaluated different social vulnerability indices, but we instead decided to do a cluster analysis, and I'll explain why in a second. And then there are also lots of measures of exposure risk that are available: digital elevation models. The first street flood IQ data was released this year. Of course, there are the FLEMA flood insurance rating maps, and also new emerging models like the Primo model. So they're all really available. That's great. So what do we do with all of this? Well, so we decided to stick with a measure of relative vulnerability. We saw the more mainstream vulnerability indices. They sort of give you this one score of vulnerability, and it's hard to disaggregate what those scores mean, what scores means once they're all sort of wrapped up. We like this cluster analysis way of understanding vulnerability, because then we could sort of break apart communities and understand what specifically might make them vulnerable. And so we used model-based clustering through the MCLUST package in R, and we produced 4 distinct clusters that you can see here. And we're going to walk through what each of them are. So the first one, cluster 1, that's denoted by this blue space here. I'm calling it in the middle, maybe the middle class cluster. What you're looking at here on your screen is this box plot of all the indicators that we considered for this analysis, whether or not people had a high school diploma, a housing burden, health insurance, whether they received public benefits, unemployment rates, all of these indicators. Everything on this side up until this red point should be read on this y-axis here, because it's a percentage, and then only the income is measured here on the second y-axis. And so what you sort of see in this first cluster is starting with the income level. This cluster group has a slightly higher median income level. The county median is around $52,000 a year. What is notable, I think, for Miami, I should mention that pretty much across the clusters, you will find just high percentages of renters in these census tracts. And same thing for foreign-born populations. That's not at all uncommon for Miami. It's just a county of a lot of renters. And then we move to cluster 2, denoted by this green space here. This is what I'm calling the least vulnerable cluster. They have the highest median income, and as you can tell, amongst all these indicators of social vulnerability, it's fairly low, and again, still a higher percentage of renter and foreign-born populations. Again, not really uncommon for Miami. Now we move into the space of more vulnerable clusters. Cluster 3, as denoted by the orange tracks on the map, is a very vulnerable cluster with a very high percentage of Black population. As denoted here, the renters population is very high here, higher rates of public benefits, of higher poverty levels. You can just see this sort of increasing across the indicators. And then the income, unfortunately, is really low down here, well below the county median of $52,000. And similarly, cluster 4, denoted by our blue tracks here, again, another vulnerable cluster, but this time, the only real difference between cluster 4 and cluster 3 is that their proportion of the Black population is quite low, and there are higher percentages of limited English speakers and the foreign-born population. So very stratified racially and ethnically here in Miami. And so moving past the cluster analysis, how do we crosswalk this with measures of civil rights exposure? So we used a bathtub model for our first measure. And the way that you want to think about this is we need to be moving from vulnerability from low to high. And then in terms of our sea level rise risk, I use the NOAA high projection scenario from the first graphic that I showed to sort of map these things together. And so the way to read this is under the NOAA high sea level rise scenario, any census tract that has a median elevation of less than or equal to 3 feet will be inundated by the year 2060. And so by the time you get all the way to these higher elevation tracts that are either greater than or equal to a median elevation of 9 feet, they won't be impacted until 2100. And then you can see the mobility typologies are distributed here. that brings us to this map where we can see how these two components are mapped together. We have our trap topologies in orange. We have our displaced typologies in pink. We have our stable typologies in green, and you can see just connecting that green and pink typologies. Those are the highest points of elevation in Miami. What's separating them is the clusters themselves, and the migrating typology represents the blue. I have another map here of separating out for clusters, but I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to pass through it. The final graphic that I'd like to show is just how race and ethnicity are distributed against these tracks by time. Just in general, the Black population, Cuban population, and non-Hispanic white populations are generally the largest groups in Miami, and so they are taking up the lion's share here. What I would like to call attention to is the non-Hispanic white population really occupy the stable and migrating groups a bit disproportionately. The Black population occupies the displaced typology a bit disproportionately. That's very consistent with how the populations are spread across low and high elevations. Future work includes running this framework with different measures of exposure risk and then translating it into the DMDU space. Knowing this information, what can we say? How do we address these scenarios of population growth or degrowth? What are relevant policies, investments to consider? How would affordable housing play out under scenarios of insurance or or where insurance may be tenuous? And what does this mean in terms of managed retreat? Thank you all.
Oops. Great, Nadia. Thank you very much for sharing with us your very exciting and very interesting work. So let's go now to the final presentation of the day and of the session. So Shinedum, yeah, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good day. Thank you for coming to this session. My name is Chinedum Eluwa. I'm from Nigeria, and I live in Massachusetts. And today I will share some of the work that I've been doing that's related to hydrologic uncertainty and how we estimate and how it affects our estimation of the benefits of irrigation efficiency. So the motivation for this work is essentially the importance of food security, and achieving food security in Africa is like where I come from. So improving the productivity of agriculture in the face of climate change is a key component of achieving food security. And so agricultural productivity is important. And to improve our agricultural productivity, there are a few approaches which involve usually the expansion of existing irrigation schemes and the development of new ones, or the improvement of irrigation efficiency. And so in this talk, I'll focus on the improvement of irrigation efficiency. So if the existing land under irrigation doesn't change, investing in irrigation efficiency can result in some savings and water savings, for example. And so these savings, when they're combined with the productive value of water, they can be monetized. And one strategy might be to use the monetization from these savings and to offset the costs that were used to invest in the technology itself. And so for such investments, cost benefits analysis, like a well-known tool, is used to assess these benefits. And there's lots of studies in the literature that have long focused on the uncertainty factors that are involved in estimating the value of water, for example. And so different studies focus on things like the crop yield, risk aversion, input prices, climate, the other types of costs, energy costs, and so on and so forth. But it's very rare that you find that studies focus on the hydraulic response to irrigation technology, and that's that's kind of the gap which I'm going to focus on in this talk. So I'll focus on the case study now. And the case study is the northern parts of Tanzania, the high district in Tanzania. And we can see like this is like northern Tanzania. Mount Kilimanjaro is right there in the Google image pointer. So Mount Kilimanjaro is here, and the basin just sits here, right to the west of Moshi Township. And so we have like a GIS rendition of that same location there. So we convert that location into like a hydrologic gridded map. We use the HBV hydrologic model. So there's sort of two basins here. There's this purple one, which is the Kikafu River, and the orange one, which is the Weru River. And we've split these basins into the top, the middle, and the lower portions, right? So it makes it easy to read the outputs. And then these dots here are different irrigation schemes that are there and where farmers are in the basin. So we have like tons of data to build this model, and so I'm gonna skip this, but I'm going to draw your attention to this figure here. So this figure is the calibration of the parameters, and a lot of our hydraulic uncertainty comes from this set of parameters here that all give similar performance, as we can see from the Nash Sutcliffe efficiency here on the x-axis. We subset those that are higher than 0.5, and we take them. There's 90 of them here. And so we use all these 90 parameters to explore the uncertainty in the hydraulic model. And then after we build the model, there's the portion where we investigate the water value itself to compute our costs and benefits. So the hydraulic model is going to give us like our cubic meters, volume of water. And so we're going to convert, do some unit conversions here with water values and costs for the area under irrigation to get what we'll use for the costs and benefits. Now, the challenge is that there isn't a lot of data on what the costs and prices are and what the water values are. So from a range of literature and just like gray literature and published papers, we found some, point estimates of what costs are, what prices are. But we know that these values are highly stochastic, they're deeply uncertain. And so we've put in some stochasticity on these values of water. And then we have our typical net present value computation here. And so the hydraulic model gives us the available water, and then all the other pieces of data fit in here. This slide here just describes what exactly we mean by irrigation efficiency and how we represent it in the model. Irrigation efficiency is in our model, and this is like a well-known, or I'll say like a typical representation in the hydraulic literature, that is the irrigation requirements divided by some quantity called efficiency, and this efficiency is a scalar quantity that ranges from 0 to 1. And so the higher you go, the less water you withdraw, and your requirement is actually, oh no, this is wrong. It should be Kc PET minus AET. So it's difference, not the quotient. So it's the difference between these two quantities here rather than the quotient. But anyway, so that's the irrigation requirement. And so we also assume that there is no expansion of irrigation during this period. And so here, this is how we represent the irrigation. So it's not changing. It's not changing spatially. We see that it's just improving in the same regions where they are. So we're not expanding it. Because when you expand it, you run into all the other complications in irrigation efficiency. And so yeah, this is the way we represent it spatially. And so given our spatial representation now, we're interested in water savings. And so we look at specific metrics, water availability in 2 seasons, right? So the long rains and the short rains. And then for each of those seasons and the water availability, we just explore the sensitivity to efficiency. And so I'll show results for these 3 locations here. There are many results, but just for this part, we'll send the message. So there's so many figures here, but if we look, the rows are the the three locations called out in the basin. Those are the rows, and the columns are three different metrics. So the first column here is just a summary of flows in the basin and how they change under different irrigation efficiency scenarios. So we see like the darkest one is the most efficient over the most area. And so in the middle one, we see like the summary is a summary of how much water we can save, right? So this is the savings, the water available after, you know, that's going downstream in these different places during the long rains and the short rains. And these box plots represent the 90 parameters which we selected earlier from the hydraulic model. And so this is where we find our hydraulic uncertainty here, and we have the median values in the black line. So it's this column and this column are the same, just for short rains and long rains. And so we'll zoom in here, focus on this plot, and then we have the median values here of long rains. So you can imagine these dark lines are essentially these bars here, and we see that in the baseline we have about 3.2 million cubic meters leaving the basin, and what our savings under improved technology are whatever is to the right of this red dotted line. And so we see that we can get up to 70% more with the highest efficiency over the highest area, right? Well, the highest feasible efficiency in this location. So we're just improving efficiency by a little quantity. This is based on local knowledge. Our partners in the region give us like some numbers which they think are feasible over, you know, some area which they also think is feasible, and these are some of the results in that regard. And so, you know, we do the same thing for the short rains, exactly the same picture, that we're gaining more water as we improve our technology. Now the more important result is for when we combine those savings with the water values which we defined earlier. And so we find that there's a wide range of uncertainty that stems from the hydraulic model, and we see the gray lines are the stochasticity from the water from the water value, the prices and the costs. But the red line are the 90 parameter sets. The width of the red line gives us the 90 parameter sets. So we can sort of compare these two uncertainty sources. So the uncertainty source is from sort of like deep uncertainty of prices and costs, and the uncertainty from the hydraulic model. What we find is that, for example, the range of water value uncertainty coming from the stochasticity of water prices and values is sort of like $10 million in terms of like net present value, right? But when we look at for the range of uncertainty from our 90 parameter sets, so you see like each of these parameter sets comes with its own uncertainty. So we see that it's almost like three times the quantity of uncertainty that we find in the hydraulic parameter sets. And so, you know, the conclusion is that, yeah, that's hydraulic uncertainty plays a substantial role and is kind of like not very well explored especially when we're thinking about costs and benefits. We usually there's a lot of focus on you know, uncertainty from yields, climate, prices, sort of exogenous uncertainties, risk aversion, and from these findings, we think it's important to make sure we characterize all the sources of uncertainty, even those that are endogenous to the model. And so, thank you, and that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Shinedum. Very interesting presentation on a very sensitive part of the world. Thanks for sharing your work with us. So, yeah, well, now we're done with the presentations. I guess we can allow ourselves to exceed some 5 or even 10 minutes, I suppose, for Q&A, if everybody's okay with this. So I would just go in order with the questions. So the first question was actually to Bri, to the R package. So yeah, the question is if there are any plans for a Python version in this.
Not at this stage. We're sort of a cluster of R people, but I think that's a good suggestion. But in terms of investment, the investment's going to be in R for a little while yet, I think.
Great. Okay, keep us posted about this. And the second question was from Diego. He's wondering if the data that you see is if the data that you use is based on global data sets or local. Also, if you're bringing ensemble from GCMs to see how they fit vis-a-vis the results of the weather generator.
Thank you. So I'm glad that you asked this question. The package is actually based on more a bring your own data kind of framework. So what you have and what's relevant to your system, you supply. So for your baseline climate, you'll supply sort of historical data that you have and then perturbations with reference to that. So that's something you bring yourself. Likewise, you'd bring relevant downscale GCMs, whether they be particular ones that you've identified or an ensemble. But you know, it's just a matter of adding those on and what you want to do and what's available to you.
Great, thanks for the clarification. And the next question is actually to Nadia. Yeah, so thanks for the presentation. And Michael is wondering what was the base for selecting the clustering algorithm? I think that's connected to the next question from Patrick Steinman, who's also wondering how did you choose the number of clusters? So yeah, I think that in general, the same question from Michael is also asking for more clarifications and details about the clustering.
Yeah, so the great thing about this package is that I didn't have to choose the clusters. The algorithm does it itself. When we were exploring options for vulnerability indices and assessments, we found that most of them are very value laden. And so we tried very hard to get to a place where we weren't imposing our own values on the indices. And so what we instead did is we picked the indicators that we felt were most relevant and we feed it into the package itself, and it clusters according to an EM algorithm.
Great, thank you very much. I think this, yeah, that was all of the questions that we had on the chat. So if anybody else has more questions, just please, I mean, you can open up your mics and just jump in. And well, actually I had a question for Nadia as well, and then I get to Shinedum. The first question I had, well, the question I had to Nadia is did you manage to, or have you managed to share these results with the local communities? Is there any source or are there any inputs from them, from local stakeholders?
We haven't done so yet because we are still, again, looking through the different sets of clusters that we can make. But at some point, yes, we plan to share with them the indicator sets that we are using for the clusters and get feedback on whether or not it's relevant to them, their decisions, and any types of initiatives that they're pursuing in the adaptation resilience space.
Great, thanks. And to Shinedum, I also had a question for you. So apart from irrigation or in general, have you noticed any other water use conflicts in your catchment, in that catchment? Are there any other water uses which would be relevant to be analyzed in this case, or do you envisage any other water uses?
So in this part of Tanzania, the main conflict is between smallholder farmers upstream and sort of like large commercial farmers downstream. And so sort of the water savings was thought, the idea was that the subsidies can go to subsidizing the cost of implementing efficient technologies for the upstream smallholders, and so sort of free up water for sort of like farmers downstream. And so that's sort of like the idea there. So there aren't too many other conflicting uses of water at least in this small part of the basin. In the bigger Kikoleta Basin, which is like where those two small rivers are, they're like infrastructure needs, reservoirs and so on and so forth, municipal as well. but not in that small region.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot for the clarifications. So, well, if anybody else has any more questions, if not, I guess that we can wrap up the, if not, we can wrap up the session. So from my part, I would just like to say thank you very much, everybody, for joining to these exciting 3 days where we heard really interesting works and very interesting inputs. So again, thank you very much. And well, it would be great to be updated about your work. And with this, I'm not sure if, well, if Diego would like to also give some words before we officially close the sessions.
Not really, Homero. I mean, to thank all the participants. I was very surprised. I do remember one of the first sessions when the DMDU Society started a few years back, and we as practitioners were looking for, you know, a lot of sort of very pragmatic examples where we could take some of this robust decision making and decision scaling and this uncertainty discussions to our client countries, you know, where we have all kinds of constraints. And I remember in the early days, I guess 5-6 years ago, many of the presentations were more, I guess, for a different audience, I felt, no? More academic. And now I think in the last couple of years, and this one in particular, we managed to organize 3 sessions with a lot of practical examples, many of them also in the southern countries. So it's nice to see how the topic is being you know, adopted in many parts of the world. And I hope that that will help us also in the bank to mainstream more and more of these methods. No? We've been working with Homero and our colleagues now for almost 10 years, and Sarah, in trying to mainstream this into our day-to-day, you know, business development and project design and planning exercises in our client countries. And now we see that there is more and more demand, growing demand, but we also see that sort of the supply of expertise is growing. So very pleased to see that. And I hope we stay in touch with many of you over the course of this, because we have a lot that we are doing as well in the bank. So thanks to all, and let's be in touch as much as we can. Thank you. Thanks, Homero, for the sharing.
Thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks also Diego for sharing this, and well, to all the presenters and of course the audience that have been with us these days.
Ciao, Sarah.
Thank you all.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Everyone.